I want to salute the Uhuru Solidarity Movement and Casey, who's here, on with us from St. Louis, in the forefront of the struggle where the Black Power blueprint is being led by the African People's Socialist Party. And I also want to salute the chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, Comrade Jesse Neville, Uhuru. And it's my honor to salute the Secretary General of the African People's Socialist Party, Gazi Kotso. Such an honor to have you here as part of this powerful discussion tonight, this burning issue that's out there. And I do want to welcome everybody who has joined this discussion tonight. I'm very excited because the question of socialism is the question of the future. That capitalism and imperialism is a dying, horrible, deadly system. It's dying, but not yet dead. And the system of the future is socialism, in which all human beings can live, nobody at the expense of anybody else. So I, just really want to get into this discussion and looking forward to hearing Secretary General Gazi Kotso of the party and, to hear from all of you about this burning question. So first of all, I want to say that I am the chair of the African People's Solidarity Committee, the organization of white people that is organized under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party as a front of the party of the African Revolution inside of the white community, inside the belly of the beast, organizing other white people to stand in unity and solidarity with the liberation of Africa and all African people everywhere under the leadership of the African working class for socialism. And our work is building a movement of white people's reparations to African people as the road to socialism for white people. So we're gonna talk about that tonight. And I just want to say that the African People's Socialist Party and the African People's Solidarity Committee is led by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. You can see him, by the way, on Friday, who will be summing up this year, this tumultuous year, 2017, that we just are finishing, and the possibilities for 2018 for African people and the oppressed people on the planet Earth. And, that would be from his Facebook page, Omali Yeshitela, at 7 p.m. Eastern. So just come on. This is Chairman Omali Yeshitela's books, one of his books, The Uneasy Equilibrium. And if you really want to understand what socialism is, what the future of the planet is, what the struggle of African people and the relationship of white people is, you must read this book. We won't be able to go through all of the points tonight. We're just going to give you a little taste, but this is an ongoing and deep discussion. So this question of socialism is very, very important because in 2016, a Harvard University poll found that 51% of young people between the ages of 18 and 29 hate capitalism. And this year in November, a poll was released by a research firm called YouGov, and it found that 44% of millennials inside of the United States say that they would prefer to live in a socialist country. Another 7% in the same poll said that they would prefer to live in a communist country. Wow, that is really powerful. And I just want to say that I join in this hatred of capitalism. It is a dirty, filthy, oppressive, murderous, and warring system. It has only one reason for being, and that is the profit motive. There is nothing salvageable. There is nothing noble. There is nothing good about capitalism. And Chairman Omali Yeshitela wrote, capitalism is built and maintained on a foundation of rapes, massacres, occupations, genocide, colonialism, and every despicable act humans are capable of inflicting. Uhuru to that. Capitalism destroys human beings, civilizations, people's government, people's culture, life itself. It's destroying the planet. And that we can't look for solutions to problems within the system that created the problems. they will never solve it. People can work forever to try to reform capitalism, but it cannot be reformed. It is built on the backs of African and oppressed people. It is built on the blood of the majority of humanity. It can't be reformed. And that's what we're going to talk about, because the road to socialism is painted black. So, you know, young people in this world have an interest in socialism because, you know, because they see the growth of the 1%. They don't see a future in the system. They see the wealthy white power, the ruling class, and they see white people, young white people see their conditions versus the poverty of African people and oppressed people around them. And they see the violent assault on impoverished African people and indigenous and Mexican people and Arabs here and around the world every day. They see this, they reject it. And socialism will mean that the profit motive will be destroyed, that we can begin to experience a society in which all human beings can thrive, everybody can thrive, in which economic production is for the needs of the people, that everybody will have housing, everybody will have health care, everybody will have transportation, food, education, a guaranteed standard of living for all human beings on the planet. And we'll take care of the planet itself. That socialism will mean an end to the oppression of women, the end to the oppression on gender, of the LGBT, of same gender loving people, end to the oppression of people from the disabilities, what's called the disabilities community. That word would be thrown out. That it will be the end to science for profit, for the arts at the expense of others. It would be the end of this oppressive system and the unleashing of the genius of African people, oppressed people, and the people on the planet Earth. It would be a flowering of humanity. It will certainly be the highest level that human beings will ever have lived under. Socialism must happen, or imperialism, capitalism, as it is today, and that has always been, will clearly wipe out human beings and the planet just to make a profit. Those days have to be over forever. So the guiding motive of socialism is the needs of the people. And I join all of those who want socialism. I want to live under socialism too. But you know, we can't be socialist just because we say we are. Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party have, you know, brought science to society. They have brought science to how history evolves, to how the interactions of people can and must be transformed. And socialism isn't a vague idea. It has specific qualities. So I just want to say, first of all, you know, that social welfare, a society that even, you know, would give people housing, healthcare, free healthcare, these kind of things, is not socialism. And if it's still ruled by white power, by the white ruling class, then those, you know, those gifts, quote unquote, can be taken away anytime, because the class in power are not the workers. So the first thing that socialism means is that workers must own the means of production. And that means the factories, the agriculture, all the means of producing the wealth for the social system, of producing the ability to produce and reproduce real life, as the chairman says. So, well, you know, we know that, as the chairman says, you know, the way people work is socialized. People come together in a social way to work. But the way that the means of production, the factories, the agriculture is owned today is private. It's private. So individuals own the means that the majority, the masses of the people need to live. And for there to be a just society, for there to be socialism, The workers must own the means of production and control it. So that's the first quality of socialism. The second quality of socialism is that socialism is built on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay, proletariat means the organized working class, the working class that is conscious of itself as a social force. It doesn't just mean a worker unorganized. It means as in the African working class in and under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party is the African proletariat, the organized African working class. But we're saying, wow, the dictatorship? Yeah, the dictatorship. We live under the dictatorship of white power, of the ruling class of white power right now. The bankers, the millionaires, the billionaires, the trillionaires, the politicians, the CEOs that run and control capitalism in the United States. We live under their dictatorship, and look at the world that we face, because everything in this world and system is for their pleasure and for generally for white people who sit on the pedestal of the oppression of African people. So yes, it's the dictatorship of the people, of the working people, that must be in power. And that the third thing is that the workers have to control the state. If there is socialism, but the state, the army and the military and the police are still under control of colonialism or neo-colonialism or capitalism in any form, then there's no power in the hands of the workers. There is no power. And there have been socialist governments that have made that mistake, like President Allende in Chile in the 1970s, who was loved by the people, but he made the people throw away their arms, to throw away their guns. And what the US did? It invaded, it bombed, and it killed Allende. And they ended up putting in a puppet dictator, neo-colonialist Pinochet, who arrested and murdered 30,000 of the indigenous and the communist activists of that country, because they had given up the power of the state. They did not seize it. So the workers must control the power of the state. So what is the state? Everybody's heard that quote, that famous quote by Chairman Omali Yeshitela on a record where he's saying, that the state is the institution of violence that protects the interests of the ruling class. The state is the police, the army, the courts, the prison. These are the faces of the state. And so, the chairman always says the state stands between, African hungry workers and all that food that's in the grocery store. Because if Africans go in and try to take food to feed themselves, the owners will send the police to kill them, to put them in prison. So when the workers take power, they become the ruling class. And the ruling class must have the state to protect the interests of the people, because imperialism is a zombie. It will try to come back from the dead. It will try to come back and take back and seize back the power. And people have to fight that, because the US always wants to wage a counterinsurgency, a war against a victorious revolution of the people. But let me ask you this. So does this mean if white people controlled the means of production and the state and had a dictatorship of the white working class, would that be socialism? No, 1,000 times no. As Chairman Omali Yeshitela would say. Well, why? We have to understand that. Why wouldn't it be socialism if we took power? If we were in Sweden and we said that this is socialism, or even if we were in, the Soviet Union, or, some other place where white people declared or won or even fought for socialism, it would not be socialism. And here's why, because we have to understand this if we want to get there, because we can be part of socialism, but under the leadership of the African working class. So here's how we have to understand it. Because capitalism was born through Europe's assault on Africa, turning African human beings into commodities for sale, the first commodities of capitalism, turning African human beings into means of production, enslavement, stealing their labor, stealing their dignity, their independence, their freedom, and also their land, their resources, and even their ideas. You know, this is their culture, their music. African arts have made billions of dollars, among so many other things, for capitalism. And capitalism was born through the genocide of the indigenous people and the theft of their land. That's how it was born. There's no other way. Capitalism was born through colonialism, the armed occupation of a whole people by an alien society. That Europe came out of the caves of Europe, out of feudalism, out of a situation where there were few members of the aristocracy, the lords and ladies of the castle, and the majority of white people were serfs with basically no freedom whatsoever. This was a situation that the majority of white people lived in the world. Europe was poor, as the chairman says. It just came through the plague in the Middle Ages, and it rescued itself, it saved itself by assaulting Africa, the Americas, Asia, the Arab countries. Europeans did this for economic and political benefit of white power and white people. And it was this that transformed the feudalism of Europe into capitalism, that changed and transferred the majority of white people from serfs into workers, so that even white working people, white workers, got our start on the pedestal of the oppression of African people. This is how capitalism was born, through colonialism, through the armed occupation of whole peoples by an alien society in Africa, in the Americas, Asia, and Arab, Europe, and for the benefit of Europeans. So slavery, the enslavement of African people for 600 years, for hundreds of millions of Africans, genocide, colonialism, this is not one-off. This is not an anomaly. This is not the exception. It wasn't like there was this nice little system of capitalism, but these other bad things were going on. As the chairman showed us, it was a system of capitalism. It is in its nature. This is the DNA of this system. This is the pedestal upon which capitalists, the whole system of capitalism rests. Therefore, this is why Chairman Omali Yeshitela says that we have to understand that capitalism is parasitic. It was never born of its own initiative. It was never benign. It never existed nicely in Europe and then turned into bad imperialism. It started that way. It started that way. You know, from the very beginning, the so-called founding fathers of white power, Washington, Jefferson, they were owners of hundreds of African people. They bred Africans. They forced them to reproduce and sold their children. They beat them. Thomas Jefferson not only raped Sally Hemings when she was 13 years old, but he had a whole factory on his plantation, his huge plantation in Virginia, that forced African little children to make nails, That's what he produced, nails. He had little African children making nails, and you can read the whole story of it. It's out there, how he set it up in competition between the children so that they would end up fighting and hating each other so that he could make all of this money. And he, was supposedly this brilliant fighter for democracy that so many people, white liberals and white leftists, uphold today. This is what capitalism is born on. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington are perfect examples of what it is. They were part of the genocide against the indigenous people. They stole this land. Virginia isn't it doesn't belong, white people aren't native to that. Indigenous people are. This is their land and it's still there today. And that enslavement, assault, the rape and pillage of entire countries and nations of people The theft of land and resources requires violence. It requires violence because all human beings resist, fight back, fight the power of the state. They fight this. They resist. They say, no, you are not taking my family. You are not killing us. You are not taking my land, my civilization. They fight back. So it requires violence. And the violence of the state came that way. And it meant that all white people, including workers, sit on this pedestal on the backs of African indigenous people. That's how we began to be able to, even in the first place, come to the United States or come to South Africa or come to Kenya or Australia or any place else in the world where we were settler colonizers that enabled us to walk up the ladder of the success. All we had to do was participate in the violence against the indigenous people, steal their land, and to be able to carry out the violence to maintain the oppression and enslavement of African people, and to say that African people on this land created, this stolen land, created the greatest wealth under this violence for their very survival that the world has ever known. So that billions of dollars in gold and wealth and sugar, tobacco, silver, all the things that the US and Europe were stealing from African people, from the indigenous people, from oppressed people around the world, all of this incredible wealth began to be flowing into Europe. And white workers in Europe fought for some of that wealth to be able to share some of the loot, the stolen loot, sitting on the backs of the oppression of African people. So as white people, we carried this out. We carried out state violence against the colonized inside the US and around the world. Yes, we did. We acted as the state when the US didn't even have a state yet. We were out there. We were out there making our own volunteer cavalries to murder the indigenous people and take their land, or lynching, burning, murdering, and slaughtering African people to maintain the oppression of African people and to try to make sure that they would never resist and rise up, and that we would continue to have jobs, have opportunities, have land, have the ability to send our children to college based on this reality. As much as we want to ignore it, this is the truth. And Chairman Omali Shatella forces us to look at this truth. And the chairman has shown that Marx and Lenin believed that workers in Europe would lead the struggle for socialism, that would lead the struggle inside of Europe, and that would lead the whole world to socialism. But the chairman proves that Marx and Lenin are wrong. And the chairman doesn't denounce Marx and Lenin. He upholds them as people who tried their best to struggle against this capitalist system, to understand it within the period of time that they lived. But they also lived on the pedestal of the oppression of African people. And so it couldn't be that, in Europe, all of these white workers who were on strike and struggling in the 1840s were going to lead the world to socialism and overturn capitalism in a system at the same period that had the most massive trade in African human beings, the sale of African human beings that had ever existed in history, unprecedented wealth coming from that. Or in the 1840s, when the struggles of white people were happening in Europe, when the US was stealing the land of the indigenous people day after day, when the gold rush was taking place in Europe, in California, and when the US was stealing Mexico, half of Mexico, to make this United States, and which it was giving away the land of the indigenous people. So the chairman has shown that conditions faced by African people inside the borders of the US are colonialism, not racism. We will talk about that much more in another one of these discussions. But the same conditions of colonialism under the state, under the colonial state, under a system that economically benefits the oppressor nation, that's us. We are part of the colonizing nation. That's what we mean in the Uhuru movement when we say there are two Americas, because white people live one existence and African, indigenous, and colonized people lead a whole different existence. So we are the oppressor nation. That's us, even as workers. And even if we don't like it, we sit on this pedestal. We can't change that. The chairman shows that African people are not a race. They are an oppressed nation of people forcibly dispersed around the world. And as a nation of people, they have a right to struggle for their homeland, which is Africa, and the return of all their stolen resources. So when African people from around the world unite, as the African People's Socialist Party is doing by building what's called the African Socialist International, that unites organizations of the African People's Socialist Party based in Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, the US, Canada, South America, wherever African people are, to be a giant party of African people willing to fight and liberate Africa in unity with all oppressed, colonized, indigenous peoples around the world. That is how we will see socialism in this world. And that when African workers rise up, you know what? The liberation of Africa will be the death knell of US imperialism. China wasn't able to do that alone. Vietnam wasn't able to do that alone. No single country could be victorious against imperialism and capitalism, because capitalism is a world system based on the control of oppressed and colonized peoples around the world. But when African people dispersed all around the world and throughout Africa, as African people, 1.5 billion strong, African people organized around the world under the leadership of the Party of the African Working Class can destroy US imperialism. US imperialism and capitalism cannot function one day without sucking the blood of Africa and African people, and that can usher in the conditions for oppressed peoples around the world to liberate themselves and institute a socialism that will be victorious forever against capitalism and all its minions. So inside the borders of the US, colonized African workers are the leading force against capitalism. White workers will not lead the struggle against capitalism. We can't, we never will, we never could, because we're opportunists, because we've only fought for ourselves, because we sit on this pedestal that we've said, oh, we want liberation, we want freedom, we want, workers' councils, whatever, but we want to maintain colonialism. We have never struggled on the side of African and indigenous people. We've only said that it's their responsibility to join us, in the struggle against racism, the ideas in our heads. No way. We've never taken a principled stand. Just as in France, when the people of Algeria, when Africans in Algeria were rising up and fighting against the French colonialism, the French Communist Party said they can't do that because Algerians are part of France, and the Algerians said, hell no, so, and it forced anybody who considered themselves progressive and a socialist inside of France to disengage with the opportunist white left and stand on the side of the oppressed and colonized peoples. So we're saying that we're not about white workers coming to power, because every time we do that, we're only about struggling for a greater percentage of this parasitic loot stolen from African people and the people on the planet Earth. We're saying, oh, let white workers help govern equally with the ruling class, and so that's not what socialism looks like. White socialism, in fact, isn't that what Nazis stood for? National Socialism? That's what it is. It's based on maintaining colonialism, the colonial domination of oppressed and colonized peoples. The capitalism world system can't just exist in one country. African workers lead the struggle for socialism in the whole world. The US government recognized that. That's why the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who launched the COINTEL program, the counterinsurgency against the African liberation struggle of the 1960s, said, that that the Black Power movement of the 1960s, the Black Revolution, was the greatest internal threat to the US since the Civil War. Not the anti-war movement then, not anything else that was going on inside of the US at that time. It was the leadership of the African working class. The US government recognized that. The Vietnamese people recognized the significance of the liberation war that African people were waging in Detroit, in Watts, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, all around the US, fighting against, making the US government fight on two fronts, in Vietnam and inside the borders of the US. But white people and white leftists have not recognized that the African population of the US, the African workers, are the leading force inside the borders of the US. So that a world in which the resources go towards the needs of the people, where true peace can reign, an end to war, to oppression of every type, to real happiness, to beauty and creativity, the joy of living, repairing the damages to humanity who have suffered so much because of what we have done to them, and repairing the damages to the planet itself and all its beings. This is the world that must be. This planet itself won't even survive without that. There has to be socialism. There has to be the leadership of African workers and oppressed and colonized people around the world instituting what socialism really is. We can have a relationship to it, and our role is reparations. Reparations is to African people and the return of this land to the indigenous people. This is the road to socialism for white people. That this weakens the US government from within by winning millions of white people away from unity with white power and imperialism. And what we're about is seizing the resources of parasitic capitalism, turning them back over from those from whom it has been stolen. That African people built the wealth of this system. This wealth must be returned to it and all of its stolen resources, so that Africa can be free, so that African people can govern and have the power and resources that are theirs. So this is in our interest. This is how we as white people become socialists, under the leadership of the movement of the African working class, under the movement of the African People's Socialist Party, that has always stood with all oppressed and colonized peoples on the planet Earth, and which also believe that there are those from the white community who can turn loose our whiteness, who can jump off this pedestal, who can stand under the leadership of the African Revolution and join the future and take responsibility for what we've done and be part of building a future, not parasites. We can end our relationship as parasites. This is in our interest. This is the only socialism that really exists in the world. This is based on the science. And our relationship to the struggle of African people and the African working class for liberation and socialism is not as an ally. It's not even really solidarity. It's our struggle too. We have a place in this. And that place, as designated by the African People's Socialist Party, is to go into the belly of the beast and break that open. When the majority of white people to recognize that we don't have to be in despair. We don't have to be killing ourselves and ODing on drugs, that we can join and be part of a future by taking responsibility for being on the pedestal of African people for 600 years, living at their expense, by turning resources back over, by paying reparations, and by participating under the leadership of the socialism led by African people to do our part, what we are assigned to do, to bring about and do our work in this front of the strategy of African liberation, to do what we are supposed to do, to bring down the belly of the beast from within. So, we pay reparations. And I just wanted to end by saying that a long time ago, as a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, I was living in New York City with other comrades. And, we were struggling for reparations. And, we were always figuring out ways to raise resources that go to the work of the African People's Socialist Party that leads the revolution, that is not funded by any other source but through reparations and support from the African population, reparations from white people. And so we went to this big leftist anti-war rally up in Central Park in New York City, and we took hundreds of chocolate chip cookies to sell as a fundraiser for what we're doing, this reparations. So all these white leftists were like joking and they made fun of it. They were like, oh, Uhuru is out there selling cookies. What does that have to do with socialism? Well, selling chocolate chip cookies has everything to do with socialism because it is a stand of reparations to African people. And that's how we get to experience socialism. That's how we come to a principled position. And these chocolate chip cookies were about reversing the flow of parasitic capitalism. So, there's so much more to say to this. So I just want to end here and say again, urge people to read this book, An Uneasy Equilibrium by Chairman Omali Shatella, and to listen to the chairman this Friday night, 7 p.m. from his Facebook page, and to say unity through reparations, Uhuru.